Two mothers fight over a switched baby until the truth about one of them is revealed. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the child you held in your arms for months, whom you fed, comforted in the early hours of the morning, and watched give their first smiles, is not your biological child. Imagine the heartbreaking pain of realizing that somewhere, another woman is raising the baby that came from your womb, while you poured all your love into a child who belongs to her. This is not just a story about medical malpractice. It's about two women whose lives were shattered by a seemingly impossible mix-up. It's about the most painful legal battle two mothers could face, each claiming the same baby, each absolutely convinced they are fighting for what is right. But what no one expected was that, in the midst of this devastating emotional war, a shocking truth would come to light. A revelation so disturbing that it would completely change the nature of the conflict and make everyone question everything they thought they knew about motherhood, justice, and the true meaning of being a mother. What began as a hospital error turned into something far more sinister. And the truth about one of these women was about to shake not only the two families involved, but the entire community following the case. Our story begins on a rainy March night in a busy maternity ward in a small town. Two women gave birth within hours of each other. Marina, a 28-year-old teacher, married for 3 years, who had meticulously planned every detail of the arrival of her first child, and Cecilia, a 35-year-old divorced woman facing an unexpected pregnancy alone, which she considered her last chance to be a mother. Both had healthy boys that hectic night. Marina gave birth at 2:15 a.m. and Cecilia at 4:40 a.m. The babies were taken to the nursery for routine procedures, while the mothers rested from the exhaustion of childbirth. What no one noticed at the time was that the identification bracelets had been switched during the chaos of the shift. When the babies returned to their supposed mother's rooms hours later, each received the other's child. Marina looked at the sleeping little face and felt that instant love that all mothers describe. Cecilia did the same, already mentally planning the bright future she would give that child. Neither of them could have imagined that they were holding the wrong baby and that this silent switch would define the next few months of their lives in unimaginable ways. The first 4 months went smoothly for both families. Marina and her husband, Rodrigo, immersed themselves in the exhausting but rewarding routine of first-time parents. They photographed every moment, shared the small milestones of their baby, whom they had named Gabriel, on social media, and received emotional visits from relatives who commented on who the boy resembled. Meanwhile, Cecilia raised her baby, whom she named Lucas, alone, working from home as a graphic designer to balance the demands of single motherhood. She had adapted surprisingly well, finding in that little being the motivation she needed to move forward after her difficult divorce. But it was during a routine 4-month checkup that the first warning sign appeared. Marina's pediatrician noticed something unusual in Gabriel's blood tests and ordered further tests. At the same time, Cecilia took Lucas for a routine vaccination, and the experienced and attentive nurse made a casual but significant comment about how the baby did not present any physical characteristics compatible with the blood type listed on his birth certificate. They were small coincidences, casual comments that could easily have been ignored, but they planted the first seeds of doubt. The truth began to unfold when Marina, worried about the inconsistencies pointed out by the pediatrician, decided to take a paternity test at the insistence of her mother-in-law, who had always commented on how Gabriel didn't resemble the family at all. The result was devastating. Neither Marina nor Rodrigo were the biological parents of the baby they had raised for the past 4 months. Her world collapsed. Between tears and desperate phone calls, Marina contacted the hospital demanding explanations. The internal investigation was quick and revealed the unforgivable error. The bracelets had been switched that chaotic March morning, and there was another mother in the same situation. When Cecilia received the call from the hospital, her first reaction was total disbelief, then anger, and finally overwhelming panic. She was also advised to take a DNA test, which confirmed Lucas was not her biological son. Somewhere, Marina was raising Cecilia's baby, and Cecilia was raising Marina's baby. The hospital offered mediation, counseling, a formal apology, and spoke of financial compensation. But none of that mattered in the face of the question that tormented the two women. What to do now? How to break a 4-month bond? How to hand over the child you consider your own to another person, even knowing that biologically the child belongs to that person? The first meeting between Marina and Cecilia was scheduled by the hospital with the presence of psychologists and mediators. It was supposed to be a civilized encounter where two rational women would discuss the best way to deal with the impossible situation they found themselves in. But the reality was completely different. Marina arrived accompanied by Rodrigo and her lawyer, already prepared to fight. Cecilia arrived alone, but with a fierce determination etched on her face. When the babies were brought into the room, something extraordinary and painful happened. Both women instinctively reached out not to the baby they had created, but to the baby who was in fact biologically theirs, as if some primitive instinct guided them. Marina looked at the boy in Cecilia's arms and saw traces of the husband she had ignored before. Cecilia looked at the baby with Marina and recognized her own eyes. But then came the hardest part. Holding the baby they had created and feeling the same overwhelming love, the same connection. Marina couldn't simply give Gabriel up. Cecilia couldn't abandon Lucas. The two mothers began to cry simultaneously, and what should have been a peaceful mediation quickly turned into a devastating emotional confrontation. Marina demanded the immediate return of her biological son. Cecilia refused to hand over Lucas, arguing that 4 months of raising him meant more than genetics. And it was at that moment, in that room charged with tension and despair, that the most complex legal battle began. The case took an unexpected turn when both families decided to take the matter to court. Marina and Rodrigo hired one of the most renowned family lawyers in the region, known for his aggressiveness in custody disputes. Their strategy was clear: to immediately claim their biological son and offer Cecilia a controlled visitation schedule for the baby she had raised, Lucas. For them, the solution was obvious. Each mother should keep her biological son, and any emotional bond created during the 4 months of the exchange could be gradually dissolved with psychological counseling. Cecilia, on the other hand, hired a lawyer specializing in children's rights, who presented a completely different argument. According to her, abruptly removing the babies from their adoptive mothers would cause irreparable trauma to the children. Cecilia proposed a gradual transition, which could take months or even years, where both babies would live with both families until definitive custody was established. But behind this seemingly reasonable proposal, there was something more. Cecilia wasn't just fighting for the baby she had raised, she was fighting for both babies. In her initial petitions, her lawyer argued that Cecilia had the right to raise both Lucas and her biological son, Gabriel, since she had been unjustly deprived of the first 4 months with her own son. The proposal was audacious and practically unprecedented. Cecilia wanted to keep both children. The media uncovered the case, and it became a national sensation. Television programs heatedly debated the fairest solution. Child psychology experts were called upon to comment on the harm different resolutions could cause. Support groups for mothers were divided. Some defended Marina, arguing that the biological right was undeniable and that Cecilia was being selfish in trying to keep a child that wasn't hers. Others supported Cecilia, stating that motherhood is built day by day, in sleepless nights, in diaper changes, in offering comfort, and that 4 months of bonding couldn't simply be erased. Meanwhile, the court hearings became increasingly tense. Marina always appeared impeccably dressed, accompanied by Rodrigo and her parents, projecting the image of a structured and stable family. Cecilia appeared alone, but articulate and emotionally intense, winning the sympathy of some by talking about the challenges of being a single mother and how those babies were all she had. The judge in charge of the case, Dr. Alberto Mendez, a veteran with 30 years of experience, publicly admitted that this was the most complex case he had ever faced. He ordered complete psychological evaluations of both mothers, bonding studies with the babies, and opinions from multiple specialists. But while the legal process dragged on, something was happening behind the scenes that no one yet suspected. It was during the third hearing that the first inconsistencies in Cecilia's story emerged. Marina's lawyer, always meticulous in his investigation, began to question details of Cecilia's past that didn't make sense. He discovered that the divorce she mentioned had been extremely turbulent and involved serious accusations of unstable behavior. Cecilia's ex-husband, Eduardo, was contacted by Marina's legal team and revealed disturbing details. According to him, Cecilia had become obsessive during the marriage, especially after discovering she had difficulty conceiving naturally. She had undergone multiple fertility treatments, all unsuccessful, which had plunged her into a deep depression. The marriage couldn't withstand the pressure, and they separated. But then, just 6 months after the divorce, Cecilia announced she was pregnant. Eduardo always found it strange, as they hadn't had relations in the last months of their marriage, but Cecilia insisted the pregnancy was the result of a casual relationship she had had shortly after the separation. He never questioned her further, assuming she had moved on. However, these details raised a disturbing question. If Cecilia had so much difficulty getting pregnant, how had she managed to conceive naturally and so quickly? Marina's lawyer asked the judge to investigate all of Cecilia's medical records related to her pregnancy, and that's when the truth began to emerge. Hospital records revealed something shocking. Cecilia had checked into the maternity ward that March night claiming to be in labor, but initial examinations showed inconsistencies. The on-duty medical team, overwhelmed and dealing with multiple simultaneous births, did not investigate further. Cecilia was kept under observation, and during the confusion of the early morning hours, ended up being processed as one of the women in labor. But now, with the records being meticulously examined by court order, medical specialists pointed out that Cecilia's vital signs and physical condition were not consistent with someone who had just given birth. There were discrepancies in the times, an absence of certain standard procedures, and most disturbingly, there was no record of the placenta or other biological materials that inevitably accompany childbirth. When confronted with these inconsistencies in a closed hearing, Cecilia initially stood firm in her story, but under increasing pressure and faced with irrefutable medical evidence, she finally broke down. Between sobs, she confessed a truth that left everyone in the room paralyzed. She had never been pregnant. Cecilia had faked her entire pregnancy using progressively larger fake bellies, avoiding regular medical checkups with various excuses, and meticulously planning what she would do when the time came to give birth. Her original plan was to go to a distant maternity hospital, simulate an emergency premature birth, and somehow manage to get a baby in the confusion. But fate offered her something better that March night. A golden opportunity when she noticed the disorganization in the nursery. Cecilia's confession completely transformed the nature of the case. What was a complex but understandable custody dispute between two mothers victimized by a hospital error turned out to be something much darker. A case of identity fraud, misappropriation, and potentially even kidnapping. Investigations deepened and revealed that Cecilia had been present at the hospital hours before her supposed labor, circulating through the maternity ward corridors, observing, planning. Security cameras showed her entering and exiting restricted areas. Hospital staff, when questioned again, began to recall strange details. Cecilia asking specific questions about nursery procedures, demonstrating unusual interest in baby identification routines, observing the new mothers with disturbing intensity. A nurse reported that she had offered to help reorganize the identification bracelets when there was confusion during a shift change, and although he had politely refused, it now took on a sinister meaning. Cecilia had not been an innocent victim of a hospital error. She had been, at the very least, an active participant in the exchange, possibly even the orchestrator. The public prosecutor was immediately contacted, and Cecilia went from being a party in a custody dispute to being investigated in a criminal inquiry. Marina and Rodrigo, who had previously faced an agonizing moral dilemma about how to proceed, now had clarity. The baby they had raised, Lucas, did not biologically belong to Cecilia because Cecilia had never given birth. Lucas was someone else's child, and that person needed to be found. The search for Lucas's biological mother became an absolute priority. The hospital reviewed all the records from that March night, checking each woman who had given birth. Besides Marina, 3 other women had given birth to boys during that period. 2 of them were quickly ruled out when DNA tests confirmed compatibility with their babies. The 3rd woman, Patricia, had given birth to a boy at 5:20 a.m., shortly after Cecilia's supposed delivery. Patricia was a young woman of only 19 years old, single, from a neighboring city. The records showed that she had left the hospital with her baby the following day, signing all the necessary documents, and seemingly without problems. But when the authorities tried to locate her at the address provided, they discovered she had moved without leaving a trace. After days of searching, Patricia was finally found in a shelter for vulnerable women in another city. When informed of the situation, her reaction was one of complete confusion. She insisted that she had taken her baby home, that she had cared for him for 2 weeks before, desperate and without financial means, making the most painful decision of her life. Leaving the baby on the doorstep of an orphanage with a note asking them to take good care of him. The orphanage confirmed receiving the baby, but something didn't make sense. If Patricia had given her baby to the orphanage, and Marina was raising Gabriel, who was Lucas? The answer came when DNA was tested. Lucas was Patricia's biological son. The complexity of the case reached almost incomprehensible proportions. The truth now revealed was that not just 2 children had been switched, but 3. In the confusion of that chaotic early morning, with Cecilia circulating through the nursery and possibly manipulating the bracelets, 3 babies ended up with the wrong mothers. Marina received Gabriel, who was Patricia's biological son, not Cecilia's. Cecilia received Lucas, who was Marina's true biological son. And Patricia, the 19-year-old without resources or support, received a 3rd baby, who in the records was listed as the son of a 4th woman who had given birth that night, but who had already been confirmed to be with her correct child. The investigation revealed that this 3rd baby, whom Patricia had left at the orphanage believing it to be hers, was actually the son of a woman named Sylvia, who had left the hospital convinced she had her correct baby. When Sylvia was informed of the situation, she was shocked to discover that the child she had raised for the past few months was not hers. The case exploded in complexity. Now there were 4 families involved, 3 babies who needed to be reunited with their rightful biological parents, a woman under criminal investigation, and legal and emotional issues with no clear precedent in legislation. The media followed each development with increasing intensity, and the pressure on the judge to find a just and swift solution was immense. But how to resolve a situation where genetics, emotional bonds, time spent raising children, and criminal circumstances were so intricately intertwined? While the criminal investigations against Cecilia continued, revealing a deeply disturbed woman who had constructed an entire alternative reality around a non-existent pregnancy, the judicial focus needed to return to the children. The judge determined that the absolute priority was the well-being of the babies, who were now almost 7 months old. Child development experts were consulted and were unanimous, abruptly removing the children from the only mothers they knew, even if those mothers were not their biological parents, would cause significant trauma. On the other hand, allowing the situation to continue indefinitely was also not an option. An intermediate solution was proposed. A 6-month transition period where there would be gradual cohabitation between the babies and their biological parents, with intensive psychological support for all involved. Marina would finally meet Lucas, her biological son, but would not be forced to abandon Gabriel immediately. Patricia, the young mother who had believed she had made the impossible choice of giving her son up for adoption, would have the chance to meet Gabriel and decide if she wanted to reintegrate motherhood into her life, now with adequate support. And Sylvia would have to process the revelation that her baby was in an orphanage while she was raising someone else's child. It was an imperfect solution to an impossible situation, but it seemed to be the only option that prioritized minimizing the suffering of the innocent children at the center of this whole tragedy. The first supervised meetings between the mothers and their biological children were filled with emotion. Marina held Lucas for the first time and couldn't hold back tears as she recognized features of herself and Rodrigo in the baby's face. But her eyes also constantly turned to Gabriel, the child she had cradled for months and who she now discovered had no genetic connection to her. Patricia, nervous and visibly insecure, held Gabriel with an almost reverent gentleness. But it was evident that she didn't feel like his mother. She had spent months processing the pain of giving up her son, and now discovering that she had never actually given up her biological son, but rather another child, created an emotional turmoil she could barely articulate. The psychologists observed everything meticulously, taking notes on every interaction, every look, every gesture. They were building reports that would directly influence the judge's final decision on custody. Meanwhile, Cecilia remained in custody, awaiting trial on multiple criminal charges. In her statements, she oscillated between deep remorse and elaborate justifications about how her desire to be a mother had become an uncontrollable obsession after years of failed fertility treatments. She cried when speaking of Lucas, saying that she had truly loved him, that every moment caring for him had been genuine, even if the way she had conceived that child was criminal. Her defense attorney attempted to construct a plea of temporary insanity, but it was difficult to ignore the level of premeditation involved in faking an entire pregnancy and manipulating hospital routines. 3 months had passed in the transition process, and something unexpected began to emerge from the psychologist's reports. Against all expectations, the children were demonstrating remarkable resilience. Babies, the experts discovered, are surprisingly adaptable when the transition is done with care, love, and consistency. Lucas was gradually getting used to Marina and Rodrigo, and although there were moments of strangeness, he was beginning to respond positively to their care. Gabriel, in turn, remained clearly attached to Marina, but was also forming a bond with Patricia, who, with the support of social workers and support groups for young mothers, was slowly gaining confidence in her ability to mother. Sylvia's case was different. After much suffering, she had decided to allow her biological son to be adopted by the family that had raised him in recent months, feeling it would be less traumatic for everyone. In exchange, she requested regular visitation rights, which were agreed upon. It was an unconventional solution, but one that seemed to work for that specific family. Meanwhile, the dates for the final custody hearings were approaching, and the judge needed to make definitive decisions that would affect these lives forever. The central question remained: what weighed more, the biological bond or the emotional bond? And how to balance the rights of the biological mothers with the well-being of the children who had been raised by others during the most crucial months of their early development. The final hearing was scheduled for a September morning, exactly 6 months after the discovery of the baby swap. The courtroom was packed with journalists, child rights advocates, psychology experts, and curious onlookers who had followed the case in the media. Marina and Rodrigo arrived early, dressed soberly and carrying a bulky folder containing all the medical and psychological reports and documentation proving their ability to raise both Gabriel and Lucas. Patricia arrived accompanied by her social worker, visibly nervous but determined. She had spent the last few months in intensive therapy, processing not only the trauma of believing she had abandoned her son, but also the complexity of discovering that her son had been raised by another family who loved him deeply. Judge Alberto Mendez entered the room with a grave expression, carrying stacks of documents representing hundreds of hours of investigation, testimonies, and evaluations. Before beginning to read his decision, he made a point of addressing everyone present. He spoke about how this case had challenged not only the law, but the very understanding of what it means to be a family. He mentioned that he had lost sleep, that he had consulted precedents from various countries, that he had spoken with experts from a wide range of fields, and that even so, he knew that any decision he made would cause pain to someone. There was no way everyone could come out of this situation happy. The question was not how to avoid the pain, but how to minimize it, especially for the children who had not chosen any of this. The silence in the room was absolute as he prepared to read his sentence. The judge began by addressing Cecilia's case, completely separating it from the custody issues of the other families. He declared that Cecilia would be formally charged with falsifying documents, misappropriation, and contributing to the kidnapping of a minor, considering that her actions had directly resulted in the separation of babies from their biological mothers. She would face criminal trial at a date to be determined, but the judge made it clear that regardless of the outcome of that trial, Cecilia would never have any custody or visitation rights over Lucas or any of the other children involved. The bond she had created with Lucas, although emotionally real for her, was legally null because it had been built on lies and criminal acts. The judge was emphatic in stating that he recognized Cecilia's psychological suffering related to infertility, but that this in no way justified her actions, which had caused immeasurable suffering to multiple innocent families. This part of the sentence was received with approval by the majority present. Cecilia, who was watching the hearing via video conference from the prison where she awaited trial, remained motionless, silent tears streaming down her face. She had lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, and most painfully, the baby she had raised for 4 months and whom she genuinely loved, even though it had all begun with a criminal act. Her lawyer angrily took notes, already preparing the appeals she would try to file, but everyone in the room knew it would be extremely difficult to overturn that decision. The judge then paused, took a sip of water, and prepared to address the most complex part: the issue of custody of Gabriel and Lucas. The judge explained that he had carefully considered 3 fundamental principles in his decision: the principle of the best interests of the child, which must always prevail, the principle of preserving already established emotional bonds, and the principle of the biological right of the parents. He acknowledged that these 3 principles often conflicted in this specific case, and that it was impossible to satisfy them all completely. With the case of Gabriel, the baby that Marina and Rodrigo had raised, but who was Patricia's biological son, the judge detailed the psychological reports that showed an extremely strong bond between Gabriel and Marina. The child recognized Marina as his mother, responded to her touch, calmed down with her voice, and showed all the signs of a secure and healthy attachment. On the other hand, although Patricia had visited Gabriel regularly during the last 3 months, and although an initial bond was forming, the psychologists were clear in stating that Gabriel still saw Patricia more as a familiar and kind person than as a primary maternal figure. Patricia, despite her admirable efforts, was still learning to be a mother, still building confidence in her own abilities, and experts expressed concern about whether she would have the emotional and practical resources to assume full responsibility for Gabriel immediately. Furthermore, Patricia had been honest in her statements about her doubts. She loved Gabriel as her biological son, but she also acknowledged that she had spent months processing the grief of having lost him, and that this grieving process had created an emotional distance that was not easily overcome simply because the truth had been revealed. The judge then announced his decision regarding Gabriel. Primary custody would be granted to Marina and Rodrigo, who had unequivocally demonstrated their ability to provide a stable, loving, and structured environment for the child. However, recognizing Patricia's rights as the biological mother and the importance of Gabriel eventually knowing his origins, the judge established a progressive visitation schedule. Patricia would have regular and supervised visitation initially, with a gradual increase as she demonstrated emotional and financial stability. Most significantly, The judge determined that when Gabriel turned 5 years old, there would be a complete reassessment of the situation where Patricia could request joint custody if she could demonstrate that she had built a stable life and maintained a consistent relationship with her son. Marina began to cry silently with relief upon hearing the decision. She wouldn't lose Gabriel, the boy she had raised since the day he was born, but she also knew that Patricia would always be a part of his life, which was both comforting and frightening. Patricia, for her part, had a mixed reaction. There was disappointment in not having immediate custody of her biological son, but there was also a visible sense of relief. The last few months had been overwhelming for her, and part of her knew she wasn't quite ready for full-time motherhood yet. Having time to grow, stabilize, and build a gradual relationship with Gabriel seemed, in a way, more manageable. She nodded, accepting the decision, and her eyes met Marina's for a moment, exchanging a look of mutual understanding that spoke volumes about the tacit agreement they would have to build from then on. The decision regarding Lucas was equally complex, but with different nuances. Lucas was the biological son of Marina and Rodrigo, but had been raised by Cecilia for the first 4 months of his life. After Cecilia's arrest, Lucas had been temporarily placed in the care of a foster family while the case was resolved, but in the last 3 months, he had spent progressively more time with Marina and Rodrigo. Psychological reports showed that Lucas was adapting well. Babies his age, experts explained, were still at a stage of development where the primary attachment figure could be transferred relatively easily, provided the transition was done carefully and the new caregivers were responsive and loving. Marina had proven to be exactly that. She had approached Lucas with a mixture of instinctive maternal love for being her biological son and extreme care for understanding that he had been separated from the only mother he knew. The judge noted that Marina had attended workshops on attachment and childhood trauma, had rigorously followed all the psychologist's recommendations, and had demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to Lucas's emotional needs during the transition. Rodrigo, likewise, had been a present and dedicated father throughout the entire process. The judge declared that full and definitive custody of Lucas would be granted to Marina and Rodrigo without any visitation rights, since Cecilia, the only other person who had raised Lucas, had no legal rights over him. This decision was met with general approval, and Marina held Rodrigo's hand tightly, finally allowing the hope of rebuilding her family in its entirety to become a reality. But the judge wasn't finished yet. He then addressed the issue that had been a constant point of tension throughout the process. What would happen to Marina and Gabriel's relationship now that she would have Lucas? Would there be the emotional space, time, and resources for her to continue being Gabriel's mother while also reconnecting with Lucas? Psychologists had warned about the risk of Gabriel feeling rejected or less loved when Lucas permanently joined the family. The judge had taken these concerns very seriously and included specific protective clauses in his decision. Marina and Rodrigo would be required to continue family therapy for at least 2 years, with a special focus on the dynamics between the two children and the prevention of any perception of favoritism. They would have monthly visits from social workers during the first year to ensure that both boys were receiving adequate and equal care. Any sign of emotional neglect or favoritism towards Lucas at the expense of Gabriel would result in an immediate review of custody of both children. The judge was clear. He was entrusting Marina and Rodrigo with not 1, but 2 precious lives, and that trust came with enormous responsibilities. Marina and Rodrigo verbally agreed to all the conditions, their faces visibly emotional as they realized they would have the chance to raise both boys, something that had seemed impossible weeks before. It was a victory, but one that came with the weight of an extraordinary responsibility. They would have to be parents not only to their biological son, but also to another woman's son, and they would have to do so in a way that honored both boys equally. The hearing seemed to be drawing to a close when Marina's lawyer stood up and asked permission to make a statement. The judge, intrigued, granted him the floor. The lawyer then presented a proposal that Marina and Rodrigo had been developing over the past few weeks, but had kept until the right moment to reveal it. They were formally proposing to adopt Gabriel. Not temporary or permanent guardianship, but a full and legal adoption, giving Gabriel the same rights, the same surname, and the same status that Lucas would have. They wanted to eliminate any legal distinction between the two children. Furthermore, they were proposing to create a trust fund for Gabriel's education, ensuring that he would have access to university and opportunities equal to those of Lucas. And finally, they were proposing a formal agreement with Patricia where she would be recognized as Gabriel's biological mother in his official documents, ensuring that when he grew up, he would have full access to his history and could develop a relationship with Patricia if he so wished. It was a bold and generous proposal, going far beyond what the judge had ordered. Patricia, hearing the proposal, was visibly moved. She hadn't expected this. She had prepared herself to fight for scraps of time with her son, to be a peripheral presence in his life, and now she was being offered formal recognition and a defined role in Gabriel's life. She accepted immediately, tears streaming down her face. The judge, clearly impressed by the maturity and generosity of the proposal, approved the adoption immediately, praising Marina and Rodrigo for their long-term vision and their genuine commitment to Gabriel's well-being beyond their legal obligations. In the months following the court decision, the lives of the families involved slowly began to find a new normal. Marina and Rodrigo moved to a larger house where each boy had his own room decorated with the same care and love. They established meticulous routines to ensure that both children received individual attention daily. Marina spent time alone with Gabriel every morning and with Lucas every afternoon, maintaining special rituals with each of them. Rodrigo did the same in the evening. They documented everything, not only for social workers, but so that when the boys grew up, they could see in the photos and videos that they had been loved equally from the beginning. Patricia visited Gabriel twice a week, always at the same time, creating consistency. She had landed a stable job as a shop assistant, was living in her own small apartment for the first time in her life, and had joined a support group for young mothers. She still struggled with feelings of inadequacy and loss, but she was building her life impressively. The social workers' reports were consistently positive, noting that Gabriel clearly recognized Patricia and was happy when she arrived, but also that he immediately turned to Marina when he needed comfort, indicating that his primary attachments were appropriately established. Lucas, for his part, was thriving. He had become a smiling and active baby and showed no sign of the traumas that the specialists had feared. The transition from Cecilia to Marina had been, surprisingly, smoother than anyone had expected. Cecilia's criminal trial took place almost a year after the discovery of the baby swap. The prosecutor presented a detailed case showing premeditation, deliberate manipulation, and complete disregard for the well-being of the children and families involved. The defense argued temporary insanity caused by infertility trauma and untreated depression. Medical records were presented showing that Cecilia had indeed undergone multiple failed fertility treatments, had been diagnosed with severe depression after her divorce, and had a history of obsessive behavior related to motherhood. Psychiatrists testified for both sides, some arguing that she was not in full control of her mental faculties during the period in which she planned and executed the swap. Others insisting that the level of planning demonstrated a clear capacity to understand the criminal nature of her actions. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict, guilty of falsifying documents and misappropriation, but acquitted of the more serious charge of kidnapping due to reasonable doubt about her mental capacity at the time of the events. The sentence was 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years if she demonstrated rehabilitation and continued psychiatric treatment. In addition, she was ordered to pay substantial financial compensation to Marina and Rodrigo for the emotional damage caused and was permanently prohibited from working in any capacity involving child care. When the sentence was read, Cecilia broke down in tears, but there was also a visible moment of relief on her face. She would be punished, yes, but not as severely as she could have been, and there would be a chance for rebuilding after serving her sentence. The story gained another layer of complexity when, during Cecilia's trial, details about her presence at the hospital on that fateful night were revealed. In-depth investigations of security cameras and employee testimonies reconstructed her movements hour by hour. What they discovered was disturbing. Cecilia had not only taken advantage of a pre-existing confusion in the nursery, she had actively created part of that confusion. She had turned off an incubator alarm, causing panic among the nurses. She had accidentally spilled a tray of instruments, creating further distraction. And at the crucial moment, when the wristbands were being rearranged, she had subtly switched not just 2, but 3 wristbands, creating the complex scenario of multiple swaps that had made the case so confusing initially. It wasn't a simple exploitation of opportunity, it was deliberate and planned sabotage. This level of premeditation shocked even those who had followed the case from the beginning. The hospital, facing not only public shame but also multiple lawsuits from the affected families, implemented radical changes to its protocols. Wristbands with RFID chips were introduced, allowing electronic tracking of each baby. High-resolution cameras were installed in all nurseries. The number of staff per shift was increased. And most importantly, a double-check system was established where 2 different employees had to confirm the identity of each baby before handing it over to the mother. The hospital director gave an emotional press conference where he formally apologized to the affected families and promised that nothing like this would ever happen again. But everyone knew that the scars of this case would remain for generations. 2 years after the court decision, the families' lives had found a surprisingly functional balance. Gabriel and Lucas, now 2.5 years old, were inseparable. They shared a room by choice, despite having separate rooms available. They had developed their own baby language, understood each other in ways that amazed Marina and Rodrigo, and defended each other with the fierceness typical of true siblings. For all practical purposes, they were twins who just happened not to share DNA. Marina often found herself watching them play and feeling overwhelming gratitude for having them both in her life, but also a lingering melancholy when she thought about how they had gotten there. Patricia's visits had become a natural part of the family routine. Gabriel called her Aunt Patty, and although he didn't yet understand the complexities of their relationship, he clearly liked her and eagerly awaited her visits. Patricia had visibly matured. She had been promoted at work, had started taking a technical course at night, and had even begun dating someone who knew her story and accepted her completely. She and Marina had developed, against all odds, a genuine mutual respect and even a cautious friendship. They exchanged messages about Gabriel, shared photos, and occasionally had coffee together while the boys played. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it was working. The family therapy meetings, which had begun as a court-ordered obligation, had become something everyone involved truly valued, a safe space to process complex emotions and navigate the unique challenges of their family situation. The case had repercussions that extended far beyond the families directly involved. It became a case study in law schools, discussed in debates about the limits of biological versus effective parenthood. Adoption organizations used the story to illustrate the complexity of family bonds. Hospitals across the country revised their newborn identification protocols. There were even proposals for specific legislation on how to legally handle cases of switched babies, establishing clearer guidelines on timelines, visitation rights, and transition processes. Judge Alberto Mendez, who had made the Solomon-like decision regarding custody, was invited to lecture on the case, always emphasizing that there were no easy answers when it came to situations where the interests of multiple innocent parties collided. He frequently said in his lectures that the hardest part of being a judge was not applying the law, but recognizing when the law simply did not have an adequate answer to the complexity of real human life. Marina was approached several times by producers wanting to make documentaries or films about her story, but she always refused, insisting that her priority was protecting the privacy and childhood of Gabriel and Lucas. She wanted them to grow up as normally as possible, without being defined by the trauma that had marked their first months of life. There would be enough time when they were older to decide if they wanted to share their story publicly. 3 years after the incident, Cecilia was released from prison on parole. Having served 2/3 of her sentence, she had participated in intensive therapy throughout her incarceration and, according to her therapists, had made significant progress in understanding her actions and processing the infertility-related trauma that had contributed to her mental breakdown. Upon her release, she gave a brief statement to the waiting press. With a trembling voice, she apologized again to all the families she had affected, especially Marina and Patricia. She acknowledged that nothing she said could undo the suffering she had caused, but that she would spend the rest of her life trying to be a better person and advocating for greater awareness of mental health related to infertility. She revealed that she had begun working while still in prison on a book about her experience, not to justify herself or play the victim, but to help others struggling with similar obsessions seek help before doing something irreversible. Part of the book's profits, she promised, would be donated to a foundation she was establishing to support mental health treatments for women dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss. She made it clear that she did not expect forgiveness from the affected families, that she understood she had forfeited any right to be a part of Lucas's life, and that her focus now was on contributing positively to society in other ways. Marina watched the statement on television and felt a complex mix of emotions, residual anger at what Cecilia had done, but also a hint of compassion for the broken woman she saw on the screen, and even a reluctant recognition that everyone, including Cecilia, was in some way a victim of a tragedy that had spiraled out of control. When Gabriel and Lucas turned 5, the time came for the judge-ordered reassessment. Patricia, who had prepared for this day for years, presented evidence of her stability: consistent employment for 4 years, her own apartment, no legal problems, regular participation in therapy, and a stable relationship with a partner willing to help raise Gabriel. She requested joint custody, proposing that Gabriel spend alternate weekends with her and half of the school holidays. Psychologists were called in again to assess Gabriel and his relationship with Patricia. The reports were positive. Gabriel had a healthy bond with Patricia, although he still saw Marina as his primary mother. The experts believed that joint custody could work, provided it was implemented gradually and with ongoing therapy for Gabriel to process the transition. Marina and Rodrigo, although initially apprehensive, acknowledged that Patricia had fulfilled everything that had been asked of her and more. They agreed to a 6-month trial period where Gabriel would begin spending more time with Patricia, starting with 3-day weekends once a month and gradually increasing. Gabriel, now old enough to express some preferences, said he liked Patricia and was excited to spend more time with her, but also made it clear that he wanted Lucas to be able to visit him when he was at Patricia's house, demonstrating how strong the bond was between the two boys. Patricia enthusiastically agreed, already planning how she would adapt her apartment to comfortably accommodate both boys. 7 years after the initial exchange, on a sunny spring afternoon, all the families involved gathered in a park for an unconventional celebration: the 7th birthday of Gabriel and Lucas, who, coincidentally, were born only 2 days apart and had decided to celebrate together every year. It was a big party with school friends, neighbors, and everyone's extended family. Marina and Rodrigo had organized everything, but Patricia had helped with the decorations and the cake. While the children ran and played, the adults sat under a tree, observing. A casual visitor would never guess the complex and painful story behind that celebration. They would only see happy children, smiling adults, and the kind of joyful chaos typical of children's parties. But those involved knew that every moment of that normalcy had been earned through years of hard emotional work, impossible decisions, difficult compromises, and, above all, the conscious decision to put the children's needs above their own egos and pains. Marina watched Gabriel and Lucas blow out the candles together, making their secret wishes, and felt tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of profound gratitude. Yes, the way her family had formed was unconventional and had been born from a tragedy. But looking at those two boys, So happy, so safe, so loved by multiple adults dedicated to their well-being, she couldn't regret how things had turned out. They had transformed a tragedy into something beautiful, and that was more than many families could do. As Gabriel and Lucas grew up, the time would inevitably come when they would need to fully understand the story of how they had become brothers. Marina and Rodrigo, in consultation with Patricia and with guidance from child therapists, had begun introducing elements of the story early on, in an age-appropriate way. At 5 years old, Gabriel knew he had two moms who loved him, and that Patricia was his belly mom. Lucas knew he was Marina's belly baby. At 7, they knew there had been a mix-up at the hospital when they were babies. But the full details about Cecilia, the multiple baby swaps, the legal proceedings, and the trauma they had all experienced would be revealed gradually over the years as they matured enough to process them. Marina had begun writing detailed diaries for each boy, documents she planned to give them when they were young adults, recounting the entire story from their perspectives, including their own doubts, fears, and the journey of learning to be a mother to both of them. Patricia was doing the same for Gabriel. There would be photos, letters, legal documents, everything preserved so that when they wanted to fully understand their origins, all the information would be available. The goal was never to keep it a secret, never to let them discover it accidentally, but to reveal the truth in a way that was processable and emphasized the most important thing, that despite all the confusion and mistakes, they had ended up exactly where they were meant to be, surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally. The impact of the case continued to manifest itself in unexpected ways even years later. The hospital, which had implemented drastic changes after the incident, became a national benchmark in nursery safety and was sought out by other hospitals wanting to implement similar protocols. The story had led to changes in state legislation regarding newborn identification, with stricter laws being passed. Children's rights organizations used the case as an example in campaigns about the importance of prioritizing child welfare, even in legally complex situations. Marina had eventually agreed to give an anonymous interview for an educational documentary about parenting and attachment, provided that the identities of Gabriel and Lucas were completely protected. In that interview, she spoke openly about the emotional journey of raising two boys, one her biological son and the other not, and how she had discovered that maternal love was not a fixed quantity that needed to be divided, but something that expanded to fill all available space. She spoke about the challenges, the moments of doubt, the times she wondered if she was doing the right thing, and how, in the end, looking at those two happy and healthy boys confirmed that she had made the right choice. The interview was viewed by millions and generated important conversations about what truly defines a family, about how the justice system deals with complex ethical dilemmas, and about the incredible resilience of children when raised in loving and stable environments, regardless of how unconventional the family structure may be. 10 years after the initial baby swap, Gabriel and Lucas were 10-year-old preteens, navigating school, friendships, and the first signs of approaching adolescence. The shared custody arrangement between Marina and Patricia for Gabriel had solidified into a comfortable routine. Gabriel spent most of his time with Marina and Rodrigo, but had regular weekends with Patricia, as well as part of the holidays. He had developed distinct but meaningful relationships with both mothers. With Marina, he shared his love of reading and science, often staying up late discussing books or working on science fair projects. With Patricia, he discovered a passion for art and music, spending hours drawing or learning guitar with the stepfather whom Patricia had married 2 years earlier. He didn't see it as having two separate lives, but as having one life enriched by multiple perspectives and experiences. Lucas, in turn, had developed his own distinct personality, but remained deeply connected to Gabriel. They still shared secrets, defended each other against bullies at school, and had the kind of bond only brothers who grew up together since infancy could have. At school, when other students occasionally asked why Gabriel visited another family on weekends, Lucas was always the first to defend him, explaining that family was about love, not DNA. There were difficult times, of course. There was a period at age 8 when Gabriel went through a phase of confusion and anger about his situation, questioning why he couldn't just have one mother like other children. Additional therapy helped, and gradually he came to an acceptance and eventually even gratitude for having so many people who loved him. A particularly poignant moment occurred when Gabriel was 9 years old and the school asked the children to make a family tree. After much reflection, Gabriel created a unique tree where he placed Marina and Rodrigo on one side, Patricia and her stepfather on the other, and himself in the center, connected to everyone. He also included Lucas as his brother, even knowing that biologically they were not siblings. When the teacher gently questioned him about the unconventional structure, Gabriel explained his story with a confidence that surprised all the adults. He said that his family was different, but no less valid, and that he was lucky to have so many people who loved him. The teacher, moved, shared the project with other teachers as an example of how modern families can take many forms. Marina, when she saw the project, cried with pride. That boy whom she had feared would grow up confused or resentful about his origins was, instead, developing a mature and healthy understanding of his unique situation. Inspired by Gabriel's project, Lucas created his own family tree, including Patricia as my brother's other mother, acknowledging her role in his extended family. These simple school projects symbolized something profound. The children had integrated their complex histories into their identities in healthy ways, and were building their own understanding of family that transcended traditional categories. Cecilia, who had been released from prison years earlier, had rebuilt her life discreetly but meaningfully. She had never tried to contact Lucas or any of the families directly, respecting the boundaries set by law and her own conscience. The book she had written about her experience was published 5 years after her release and became unexpectedly popular, not as sensationalism, but as an honest and painful account of mental health, infertility, and the destructive decisions people make when they don't properly address their trauma. All profits, as promised, went to the foundation she established, which now offered free therapy to women dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss. Cecilia worked as a mental health speaker and volunteered in psychiatric hospitals, helping other women who were where she had been. She had made peace with the fact that she would never be a mother and had found purpose in helping others avoid the devastating mistakes she had made. On one occasion, 5 years after her release, she ran into Marina by chance at a conference on childhood trauma where both were present, Marina as part of the audience and Cecilia as a speaker. The moment was fraught with tension. They looked at each other for a long moment, and then Marina did something surprising. She nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a recognition that Cecilia had done the work of redeeming herself, of transforming her terrible mistake into something that could help others. They didn't talk. There was no need, but that moment brought a kind of closure that neither of them knew they needed. 15 years after the babies were switched, Gabriel and Lucas were now 15, navigating high school with all the typical complexities of adolescence, plus a few extra ones due to their unique circumstances. Gabriel had become a reflective and artistically talented young man, dividing his time between the two homes in a way that was now completely natural. He called Marina Mom and Patricia Pat, but the affection he had for both was evident. Lucas had become a talented athlete and student leader, always surrounded by friends, but never forgetting his roots and his family's complex history. The two boys had decided together that they wanted to share their story publicly, feeling that they now had the maturity to do so and that it could help other families in similar situations. With Marina's permission and support, Rodrigo and Patricia gave a joint interview to a national program about unconventional families. In the interview, they spoke openly about growing up knowing they were switched at the hospital, about having multiple parental figures, and about the challenges and benefits of their unique situation. When the interviewer asked if they harbored any resentment about what had happened, both were emphatic in saying no. Gabriel said he couldn't imagine his life without Marina and Rodrigo, even knowing that biologically he was Patricia's son. Lucas said that Gabriel was his brother in the truest sense of the word, and that the bond between them was stronger because they had navigated such a complex situation together. The interview went viral, generating millions of views and comments from people moved by the maturity and perspective of the two teenagers. The interview had unexpected consequences. Multiple families in similar, though less extreme situations reached out, thanking them for bringing visibility to non-traditional family experiences. Schools began using Gabriel and Lucas's story in curricula about family diversity. Gabriel and Lucas were invited to speak at events about adoption, shared custody, and children's rights. They became, in a way, unofficial ambassadors for a new understanding of family that valued emotional connections as much as biological ties. Marina, watching her sons, couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey they had traveled. She remembered that devastating first meeting at the hospital, when she and Cecilia had argued bitterly, each absolutely convinced that she had a right to the baby. She remembered the sleepless nights, the endless tears, the paralyzing fear of making the wrong choices. And now, looking at Gabriel and Lucas, confident and compassionate young men who understood that family could be complex yet beautiful, she knew that every tear, every painful court hearing, every difficult compromise had been worth it. Patricia, watching the same interview from her home, felt similar emotions. She had started as a terrified and helpless 19-year-old, having believed she had abandoned her son. Now she was a stable, married 34-year-old woman with a strong relationship with Gabriel and mutual respect with Marina. She had grown up alongside Gabriel, in a sense, and the journey had shaped who she had become. 20 years after the initial exchange, Gabriel and Lucas were both 20 years old and in university. Gabriel was studying psychology, inspired by his own experience with therapy over the years and wanting to help other children navigating complex family situations. Lucas was studying law, specifically interested in family law and children's rights. They had chosen universities close to each other so they could continue seeing each other regularly, their bond as strong as ever. During the summer holidays that year, all the families involved gathered for a celebration, 20 years since the day it all began. It was a bittersweet moment, looking back on the tragedy that could have destroyed multiple families, but which instead had been transformed into something resilient and even beautiful. Marina and Rodrigo, now in their 40s, their hair beginning to show gray strands, looked at Gabriel and Lucas with indescribable pride. Patricia, married for 8 years, and now the mother of a 5-year-old girl, the biological daughter from her second marriage, had proven that she was capable of being the mother she had fought so hard to be for Gabriel. Judge Alberto Mendez, now retired, had been invited to the celebration and attended, visibly moved by seeing how his Solomon-like decision had resulted in well-adjusted young people and functional families. He admitted that the case had haunted him for years, always wondering if he had made the right decisions, and seeing the outcome 20 years later brought a closure he didn't know he needed. During the celebration, Gabriel asked permission to speak. He thanked all the adults present for putting his and Lucas's well-being above their own pain and egos, for making the difficult choices that allowed them to grow up loved and stable. Gabriel then revealed something he and Lucas had been planning. They had written a book together about their experience, aimed at children and teenagers navigating unconventional family situations. The book told their story honestly but age-appropriately, emphasizing themes of resilience, love, and the idea that family can take many forms. They had worked with illustrators and psychological consultants to ensure the book was useful and not just a narrative. Part of the profits would be donated to organizations that support children in shared custody or complex guardianship situations. Marina, Rodrigo, and Patricia had been consulted at every stage and had given their blessing. The book would be published the following year, coinciding with the boys' 21st birthday. The revelation was met with tears and hugs. It was Gabriel and Lucas's way of transforming their original trauma into something that could help other children, of ensuring their experience had meaning beyond their own lives. During the celebration, there was a moment where Marina, holding Lucas, and Patricia, holding Gabriel, stood side by side for a photo. The image captured something profound. Two mothers, each holding the child she hadn't given birth to, but had raised and loved, a visual testament to the fact that motherhood transcends biology. That photo would eventually be used on the cover of Gabriel and Lucas's book, perfectly symbolizing its central message. Love, not genetics, is what makes a family. In the years that followed, as Gabriel and Lucas entered full adulthood, they continued to share their story and advocate for changes in the family law system. Gabriel completed his master's degree in child psychology and began working at a clinic specializing in trauma and attachment, frequently consulting on complex custody cases. Lucas graduated in law and specialized in family law, using his own experience to inform his practice and help judges and lawyers consider the child's well-being in more nuanced ways than just biological rights versus affective rights. They lectured together, brothers in spirit if not in blood, on how the judicial system can better serve children in complex situations. The book they wrote became a standard resource for therapists working with non-traditional families and was translated into multiple languages. Marina and Rodrigo, now grandparents of a girl Gabriel had with his partner, and a boy Lucas had with his wife, often reflected on how their lives had been completely transformed by that chaotic night in March so many years ago. What had begun as the worst experience imaginable had transformed, through conscious choices, hard work, and compassion, into a rich and complex extended family that defied traditional categories but was profoundly functional and loving. Patricia, now with 3 children, including Gabriel in her heart, had become a vocal advocate for young mothers and support systems for women in vulnerable situations, frequently speaking about how the support she received had changed the trajectory of her entire life. The case, which decades ago had shocked the nation and challenged fundamental concepts about parenting and family, was now seen as a transformative example of how impossible situations can be navigated when adults put children's needs first, and when the judicial system is able to look beyond rigid precedents to find humane and compassionate solutions. Cecilia, who had been the villain of the story for so long, had completed her own journey of redemption. Now in her 60s, she dedicated her life to mental health work, having helped thousands of women through her foundation and volunteer work. She had never tried to insert herself into Lucas's life, recognizing that she had no right to do so, but she followed his achievements from afar through newspaper articles and public lectures, feeling a mixture of pride for who he had become and eternal regret for how she had almost destroyed his childhood. On one occasion, many years later, Lucas, now an adult and a father, decided on his own to contact Cecilia, not to establish a relationship but for closure. They met at a casual cafe, a brief but meaningful conversation. Lucas told her he forgave her, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because harboring anger no longer served him. He said he hoped she would continue her work helping others, that it was the best way to honor the terrible mistake she had made. Cecilia, through tears, thanked him and promised she would continue. They would not meet again, but that moment brought peace to both of them in ways they hadn't expected. And so, the story that had begun with a chaotic mix-up in a busy maternity ward, that had evolved into painful legal battles and shocking revelations, that had gone through years of difficult adjustment and complex emotional growth, came to a resolution that no one could have foreseen in those devastating early days. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everyone lived happily ever after without complications. There were still difficult moments, occasional conflicts over boundaries and decisions, and the emotional scars of the initial trauma never completely disappeared. But it was a real, human, and fundamentally hopeful ending. Gabriel and Lucas, the switched babies who were at the center of the storm, had grown into compassionate, articulate men dedicated to making the world a better place. They carried their stories not as open wounds, but as an integral part of who they were, informing their work and their relationships in profound ways. And Rodrigo had learned that love is not a fixed quantity, but something that grows to fill all the necessary space. That family is built through daily choices and not just through biology. Patricia had proven primarily to herself that difficult circumstances early in life do not determine destiny, that growth and transformation are possible with adequate support. And even Cecilia, whose unhealthy obsession had nearly destroyed multiple families, had found a way to transform her greatest mistake into something that helped others, proving that redemption, while never erasing the past, is still possible. 30 years after that fateful night in March, at an extended family gathering that now included 3 generations, the people gathered around picnic tables in a sunny park were a living testament to the fact that family is what we build, not just what we are born into. Gabriel and Lucas, now in their 30s, watched their own children play together, cousins who saw each other as siblings, repeating the bonding pattern their parents had established. The children knew their parents' story, told in an age-appropriate way, and were growing up with an expanded understanding that family could take many forms. Marina, now in her 50s, gray hair but still vibrant eyes, held Rodrigo's hand as they observed the family they had built in such an unconventional way. Patricia, sitting nearby, now fully integrated into that extended family, chatted animatedly with Lucas's wife about plans for their next family vacation. There were photos being taken, laughter filling the air, children running around, and that kind of joyful chaos that characterizes large family gatherings. No one looking from the outside would guess the complex and painful story behind that scene of domestic normalcy, and perhaps that was precisely the point. What had begun as a tragedy had been transformed through conscious choices, deliberate compassion, and love that refused to be limited by conventional categories into something profoundly ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. A family, complex, unconventional, built on improbable foundations, but a real family in every way that mattered. And as the sun set over the park, casting long golden shadows over the people gathered, there was a palpable feeling that, despite all the challenges and pain, they had arrived exactly where they were meant to be, together.